Welcome to Resilient. I'm Lorenzo, Deloitte's Research and Insights Director for our Chief Legal Officer program and host of the Chief Legal Officer track of this podcast series. What if you were able to prepare in advance for challenges that many of your peers only see in the moment? In this episode, Dianne Ralston, Chief Legal Officer at SLB, shares how her early experiences, both with cultivating resilience and being exposed to business and legal relationships, informed her strategy for building a successful legal career. Dianne also discusses her experiences holding legal leadership roles in the oil and gas industry and her insights on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's hear what Dianne has to say. Dianne, welcome to the Resilient Podcast. Thanks so much for being my guest today.
Lori, I'm really glad to be here with you.
Fantastic. Well, I would love to get started with the story of Dianne, maybe starting with young Dianne and your childhood life. Who maybe were some of your early influences?
Great. I think probably one of the things that was most impactful in my childhood was that I had the opportunity to live overseas when I was growing up. We lived in Australia for a couple of years when I was much younger. And that was because my father was in the oil and gas industry. And I have now spent much of my career in the same industry, but never anticipated that that would be the case. So that was really influential. And then also later throughout his career, we moved quite a bit. And so that manifested in, for example, attending 4 different high schools in 3 different cities. And so I think what that added to me was the ability to be flexible, to have resiliency, to understand how to be adaptable to a new situation. So that was definitely an important early influence for me.
Yeah, so as a teenager, then you had this experience of moving even from one country to the next, from one high school to the other. Your dad was in the oil and gas business. And so as you approached the end of high school, were you thinking that law was the direction you wanted to go? Or what were you thinking in terms of what college and your career might look like?
Always intrigued by the law. In fact, one of the clubs I joined was the speech and debate club in one of the 4 high schools I was in. And so oftentimes that's what those of us that are thinking that law might be interesting do. But I had an interesting experience, and it may not be unlike others. My father in his career had interactions with lawyers, and he used to joke to say he liked his lawyer and hated every other lawyer. And it made me understand that sometimes lawyers don't really know how companies operate, don't really understand the rest of enterprise because they're so kind of focused on the practice of law firm culture, which is sometimes very different. So for me, even though I had a thought that one day I might want to go to law school, it was important for me to really explore other careers and have some degree coming out of college that was meaningful in terms of getting job opportunities outside. In fact, the 2 areas that I was most interested in were architecture and business. And so I wound up picking a university that had good programs in both and dabbled a little bit between both colleges, but then ultimately wound up in the business school.
So you had this experience in speech and debate, which you liked, and then your dad kind of over your shoulder saying, I like my lawyer, but the rest of them I'm not so sure about. And it sounds like you had kind of a business oriented mind with, I can't decide if architecture is more creative or more math focused. But the collection of that was not quite leaning towards law school. So at what point did you say law school or lawyer is the way to go? What did that path look like?
So when I graduated from university, I took a job in my field of undergraduate and worked for about 2.5, almost 3 years. And then during that last year is when I was applying to law school because I wanted to really understand the business. I thought I was if I were to go to law school, it was more likely that I would be on the commercial corporate side. So I wanted to understand how businesses really worked from the inside. I wanted to use those business skills that I had learned in undergraduate. So during that last year of work is when I started applying to law school, but really thought it was going to be important to get a different experience rather than going straight through to law school right after undergraduate.
And do you have any memories from those few years of working in business that were formative? I mean, like I learned this lesson, or I realized that this thing is valuable from a business perspective. Anything you look back on now and you just say that was really helpful to learn at that point?
Well, I think the how organizations look at individuals and staffing is different than how we sometimes value those with the legal expertise. So I think that was important. The importance for understanding the metrics that businesses evaluate themselves on. So is it revenue led? Is it cost led? Is it a combination of those things? Are they a company that is very focused on quarterly results? Do they have a more long term focus? I think understanding how those drive decisions within an organization was a perspective that I probably couldn't have gained from the outside, or at least not as quickly. So I think putting those concepts perhaps that you learn in school into action and seeing how they drive culture and drive decision making was probably one of the formative things that I took with me.
Hmm. I see. And then, so you had those experiences, applied to law school. What was your law school experience like? Was it what you expected? Was it different? Did you stick with the kind of business and corporate track?
Well, I did as far as going ultimately into commercial litigation. I had an interest in litigation and was intrigued by it from early on. So that's where I ultimately wound up. In terms of my law school experience, really enjoyed law school. I think the rigor of law school is something that I anticipated I was probably prepared for, but I think that's always a bit of a surprise is just the volume and the rigor, particularly in the first year. But I really enjoyed the historical perspective and how law builds on one another and making those connections. So that law school time I really did enjoy.
Yeah, I was also surprised my first year of law school. I think I had been warned about the volume, but this idea that you could go a whole semester and then take one question or one exam with three questions, and that would be the sum total of your grade was eye-opening for sure. And
Definitely.
when you left law school, you went into a firm in a litigation role. So tell me a little bit about the early part of your career. Was your first practicing position what you expected? I know you made a couple of moves. What were you thinking as you were navigating that path, early legal career?
So I went to a large or national law firm at the time when I got out and really enjoyed the experience. But what often happens with those that are interested in litigation, if you have large litigation matters with where the amount of controversy is quite significant, the likelihood that younger associates are going to get a lot of courtroom experience, interaction with depositions and taking witnesses on deposition, that comes much later in your career. And I was in a fairly technical area. I did energy and environmental law as well as litigation in those areas, so both regulatory and litigation work. So found that very interesting, learned a lot about the regulatory framework, learned a lot about the process of litigation, but didn't have that frontline experience, which is harder to get with very significant litigation matters early in your career. So after I'd been with that firm for a number of years, then I decided to go to a smaller litigation boutique to get more of that frontline courtroom experience.
And did you get it at the boutique?
I did. I did. I enjoyed it. Parts of it were what I anticipated. Parts of it were less fulfilling than I expected. There is aspects with every practice of the law that are more administrative and sometimes less oriented toward resolution and sometimes more oriented to just the procedure. So, for example, I'm probably not a fan of arguing whether a compound question is one interrogatory or two, because I felt like those arguments really enriched the lawyers, perhaps, and at least enriched billing, but did not actually result in resolving the matter at hand. So those aspects of the litigation practice that were much more perfunctory and procedural and divisive were probably not my favorite part of it, that really weren't going to the heart of the issue or building your arguments around the heart of the case or trying to resolve the matter in a way that could be beneficial.
Yeah, I started my career focused on litigation too, and that was one of the challenges I had. It was so adversarial that I just felt like we weren't actually ever getting to a good resolution, even when we got to a resolution. And so I switched into finance because I thought it was just a kinder, gentler way to exist in legal. So from that point in your career at this litigation boutique where you were liking sounds like most of what you were doing, but maybe not all, how did you start thinking about going in-house? What made you want to explore that option?
I thought that I could perhaps add more value having been with a company and then understood the litigation process to really helping companies anticipate when something is about to become a litigated dispute and possibly helping them head it off before it became that litigated dispute. As you just mentioned, Lori, oftentimes the resolution, even if it was a negotiated settlement after litigation had begun, seem to always be less optimal than you might have reached if you were able to collaborate before it went that far, or even thought about how you structured your contracts, your agreements, your relationships well in advance to even avoid those potential conflicts to begin with. So, from my perspective, I thought that could be where I could combine my experiences and perhaps add value in a different way by taking an in house career.
And so how did you start on that search process? And tell me a little bit about how you picked your search area and how you went about identifying the opportunities.
So, Laura, you're going to make me sound like quite the dinosaur based on some of the listeners that you'll have, because I actually, in my local community, I'm a dual career person. So, always have to kind of manage my spouse's career and opportunity as well. So, I was in the greater Houston area. And so I decided to focus there because that's where my husband was working as well. And I got a publication that listed all of the major businesses in Houston and wrote a letter in a very old fashioned way to each one of the companies that sounded interesting, probably sent out 50 to 75 letters and got back some responses from those companies based on that letter writing. I also did work with a recruiting firm and got some opportunities through the recruiting firm as well. But I thought it might be interesting to see what options might come out, even if I went on my own.
So you sent out a number of letters, like pen on paper letters. Who did you hear from and what was interesting?
I got some responses, probably 10 or 15. Got from that, took a couple of interviews and even got one job offer. At the same time, I was working with a recruiter and got another opportunity through the recruiter. And ultimately, it was through the recruiter that I wound up at Schlumberger, but it was a good process to take a little bit of the ownership myself and really explore opportunities, because I understood that sometimes not all opportunities are known widely. So it gave me the comfort to know that I'd done a fulsome search at the time.
Yeah, can we just take a minute because I know that the process of looking for in-house employment is different than it was than what you just described. And even I early in my career wrote letters and put stamps on envelopes and waited to hear back. But that's not how things work today. So if you were talking to someone who was looking for their first in-house role and knowing that many of these roles require some kind of online application, what advice do you have for these lawyers who want to move in-house but need to understand what you just suggested, that sometimes not all roles are publicized? How does that look different today?
So I think there are a couple of things that I would recommend if somebody was thinking about an in-house search. Oftentimes, through your expanded network, LinkedIn, other places, you will ultimately know somebody or know somebody who knows somebody at an organization when you see a job posting. And I would do my due diligence. I think reaching out and saying, I am interested, can you give me any tips? At least it gets you on the radar screen and they know that you're interested. Sometimes that individual that you may have gone to law school with or may have started practicing with may or may not influence the ultimate hiring decision, but at least they know that you were eager enough to make that connection and make that step. And in the course of that conversation, you'll learn more about the prospective employer to decide whether it might be a good fit for you. Because I always think you need to be trying on the culture and interviewing the company at the same time that the company is interviewing you. So that would be the first tip that I would say. With regard to going through online application processes that sometimes seem very remote, and the other thing that I would say for large companies like the company I work with, we've got a great recruiting staff, but they recruit for all positions within the organization. So they may not always know the details of what that legal role will require, and the posting may seem a bit vague. So trying to anticipate both what that industry is and extrapolating what the position could be like so that you craft your responses to maybe fill in some gaps that may just be inherently part of that application. And then the last thing that I would say is, like any process that we now go through online or other places, think about something that would make you unique or stand out, because they may be combing through many, many applications. And if it's a unique hobby or skill set, if you did a unique internship, if you had some work experience that was outside of the mainstream legal, and you can find a way to relate that experience back or what you learned from that experience, I think those are all really meaningful to navigate what may seem a little bit less personal through some of the online application processes.
So you sent out letters, you were working with a recruiter, and then you were asked to join and decided to accept an invitation at Schlumberger, which of course is now SLB. Can you give us some insight into what that transition looked like?
Well, it's very interesting when you go in house to have your client literally next door. So the immediacy of your legal issues and people walking down the hall and saying, hey, I have this concern. What do you think I should do? The ability to research and investigate and look at precedent is sort of out the window. So what I found and what I actually enjoyed is that you have to lean into what you've already experienced before, extrapolate that, and find a good way to communicate to your client to say, my first impression is X. I recommend that you do Y, but I'm also going to do some background research and I'm going to come back to you with a more fulsome answer, because the pace and just the desire for them to have that initial impression is very different than what you have if you're in a firm. So I thought that was very different. And at the time I joined, and what we still do today, is rotate people through many different assignments. So even as a litigator, I was doing commercial work, I was doing employment and EEOC consulting almost from the first day. So many different areas, and the variety I really, really enjoyed, because it always gave me an opportunity to learn not only about the company, its technology, how it operates, but also new areas of the law. So it was maybe, as the expression says, drinking from the fire hose from day one. But I really, really enjoyed that experience.
Well, it's interesting that the first thing that you said was it was so great to be in the very next office from the client, right? That physical proximity, that ability to run into someone at the coffee pot or as you walk down the hall. What impact do you think the move towards hybrid work or increased work from home or work from anywhere arrangements might have on the lawyer's ability to develop those relationships, and in particular for the um, newer in-house lawyer to have those chance encounters with the head of business or the head of R&D or whomever from the company.
I think that's a very good question. And I think my company and others are continuing to struggle with that because we know that hybrid working is something that is of interest not just to the legal department, but all of our workers. But those chance encounters are important. What we're trying to do with hybrid is make sure that those experiences and when we gather together are as meaningful as possible so that we cross pollinate with other functions, so that we're planning our interconnectivity and our meetings where we're having big group meetings on those days that we're together, and then doing some of our individual work on those days that we're maybe working from home or more virtually, because I think it will continue to be important. And then the last thing that I would say is we are a global company. And so myself, my direct reports, we are trying to be very intentional about scheduling time to get back out to our colleagues around the world, and sometimes just creating those times for those interactions, both within the legal department and more broadly, so that you keep that connectivity there.
Yeah, so much more intentional about what used to be chance interaction.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So as you look back at those early years of your in-house career, um, do any moments stick out, right? So the podcast is resilient. Can you think of a moment where you just didn't get it right, or there was some setback? Maybe it wasn't your fault, but it was your responsibility to handle it. Just some challenging thing that in hindsight you're like, here's a thing I learned, or here's something I wish I had known.
So my experience, even though I thought I was doing this phenomenal job of integrating into a business culture, and I thought because I'd had my prior business experience, I would, I was killing it, is sort of the expression that I would say. And following a meeting where I was meeting with the leadership team that I was supporting at the time, we were talking about a new project and what some of the risks associated with that project would be and how we should handle it and whether we were going to go forward. Walk out of the meeting, and one of my colleagues pulls me aside and he said to me, I think of myself as pretty bright, and sometimes when you speak you make me feel stupid. And I realized from that I certainly wasn't killing it, and that he is my client, and I was allowing my communication style to get in the way of really connecting with my client. And more importantly, I probably wasn't doing as good a job as I expected in terms of synthesizing legal concepts into something that was practical and actionable. So that was a big wake up call for me and an important part of transition. And I'll say that as I've progressed through my career, that has been often the hallmark of whether somebody will be successful in house or not, is that self awareness to realize that some of the attributes that may have allowed you to be successful in law school or a law firm culture are often the things that will get in your way with your success in a different kind of culture.
That's such a great story for so many reasons. First of all, it probably was a moment of vulnerability for your client to say that to you. And my hope is that he said it in an effort to help you develop, but also a moment where you could have said, well, I am smarter than you, right? And kept on doing what you were doing. But what you did instead was really think about what he had said and what it meant to the job you were asked to do and the relationship you had with him. Although I'm sure it wasn't the easiest thing to hear or process.
That's exactly right. And I think it also reiterated the point. He was an engineer, and he said, look, I've gone to a good engineering school. I think of myself as reasonably bright. It also made me realize that there are a multitude of disciplines and experiences that really come together to make a team function. And my desire and interest to learn what those other functions do and how they operate and what their experiences were, that's really important as well. And we spend a lot of time talking about diversity, and I'm really a proponent, as many of us are, because a lot of my career, I've, for example, been the only woman in the room. But I think an aspect of diversity that we always have to think about is diversity of thought and appreciating those experiences that others who are different in their backgrounds than we are bring to the table. So I think that was also an important lesson in that exchange. And I really always appreciated his frankness and the graciousness by which he did it. He made it sort of lighthearted and a little bit of a joke and self-deprecating on his part, but also took the willingness to pass along a message that helped probably what was a brash young lawyer be more successful.
So we're at the point where you've begun your career at SLB. You seem like you were enjoying the opportunity to engage with people throughout the company, but you still decided to leave. And although you ultimately came back, can you tell us a little bit about what motivated the move out and then the return back in?
So I had the opportunity to work for a prior general counsel who was very thoughtful about how he developed his team members. And he intentionally rotated myself and his other team members through many different specializations and departments that ultimately were reporting to the general counsel. So for me, that manifested in managing the compliance program. It was then managing government affairs, M&A, some of our SEC reporting. So for somebody who started with a litigation background, I got this plethora of experiences that were really developmental for me, but very interesting. Also, during my career, I had had the opportunity to be the general counsel of one of our international businesses. So all of those experiences combined that made me really interested in stepping out and taking on a general counsel role. But I knew, given my interest in doing that and my time horizon, would not have presented that opportunity in an immediate time horizon. So I had a former colleague reach out to me about an opportunity to move into a general counsel role at another company.
So you applied to that general counsel role, you took that, and then the role you have now opened up and you were a candidate?
Yeah, a little bit more complicated than that. So, my perspective was, and I think this is an important lesson. I always want to move forward. So even though I had loved my experience, when I left, there was never a belief on my part that I would be returning. And I went to work for one company, and while I was there, actually another former colleague reached out and made me aware of an opportunity at FMC Technologies, also in the energy services space, and really interesting culture of the company, which and culture is something that's important to me, and made the switch there to take the general counsel role. The first thing that happened when I walked into that organization was I was given a term sheet for a joint venture, and the joint venture was negotiated and concluded, but then ultimately became a merger of equals between FMC Technologies and a French company called Technip. And that was a really interesting, complicated, invigorating experience to manage and navigate. First, the transaction itself and what we needed to do to get support from both boards and both sets of shareholders to move forward with that transaction. But working through a true merger of equals where the management team was evenly balanced, the board was evenly balanced, and it manifested itself in the need to do everything from review every internal policy to choose which one would be the one that we would use going forward. So, a very rewarding and important part of my career around creating that new company and being part of that leadership team as we managed and navigated through that integration.
That does sound exciting. And did your experiences earlier in your life, having moved around a lot and having lived in other countries, was that helpful as you were merging with a French company?
I think it was helpful. I think the other thing that is a big takeaway in that kind of integration context is the importance of asking the why. Both companies were successful in their own right, but inherently, two different entities are going to do things differently. So if you're going to have a successful integration, you always need to ask the question, not only what are you doing, but the why behind it before you start deciding which one is better, for example, because that's the way that you get more buy-in as you go through a complicated cultural change like an integration. But I think the real importance is spending that time to learn what some of the challenges that company may have faced that manifested in a policy or procedure covering a certain aspect that may not immediately resonate for the other company, as an example. But I
Yeah,
think that why is really, really strong.
I totally agree. The why is such a powerful question. I mean, even in the work that I do now with general counsel and legal departments, sometimes someone will ask you a question, and that's not actually the question, or the answer to that question is not the thing that's helpful. So asking why are you asking that question? What's driving that? Can uncover sometimes more helpful information to get you to a solution faster. I love that, the question of why. And so you were at FMC through this merger with Technique, and you stay in the GC role there?
I did. I was the GC of the new combined company, and was able to, as part of the executive leadership team, as I said, shepherd the company through the integration and the formation of what that company was going to stand for, everything from values, vision, and culture to how that would manifest in behaviors, and then all of the things that were associated with what a new company would stand for.
So this is a very challenging job, right? I mean, you have described it in a way that sounds like it was a wonderful opportunity to learn and explore and take on a challenge. But when I've seen general counsel and chief legal officers have to navigate the merger of two companies and cultures as you've described, sometimes the people element of that can be so difficult. What were some of the I don't know if you would call them guiding principles, or um, ethical guidelines that helped you bring those two teams together to get to a legal function that was what you wanted it to be?
So I tried to bring the new team members into the conversation about what that team should look like, because I think that's really important to get some buy-in and ownership, and for people to be part of that conversation. The companies had adjacent businesses but didn't have really overlapping businesses. So the way that you would structure a department were very different because of that. And so it goes back to that why question that we were just talking about, but trying to bring people around the table and really be part of a conversation. And I'm a big fan of the whiteboard experience, where you throw anything and everything up on the whiteboard, really allow people to brainstorm, try to get it open so that people feel allowed to share issues and allowed to share thoughts. The old "there's no such thing as a bad idea," because I think that activity helps people do two things: think about what their current state is, what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, and then from there, allow them to decide what it is that we want to be going forward. How do we want to structure? What do we want to reward from our team? How do we want to help them develop? What do we need to do in terms of planning for future growth? All of that aspect, I think, is really um, much more useful if you can make it as collaborative as possible.
Yeah, so really getting people invested in the journey of becoming one team.
Exactly.
I want to fast forward now just a little bit to where you are today, because you did ultimately return to SLB, and your role there now, I think, what do you have, Diane? Like six titles? Can you tell us a little bit about the scope of the role that you have and those various responsibilities?
Certainly. So I'm the chief legal officer for our company, and I'm also the corporate secretary, which is common for a lot of the senior legal officer for most large companies. In our organization, the compliance function also reports to the legal department. We have also created, and many companies are moving this way, an independent client contracting organization as well as a supply chain contracting organization. So those contracting lawyers and contract professionals also are part of my team. So we have about 400 legal compliance and contract professionals around the globe, probably have team members in about 50 different countries.
That sounds like a really big job. Um, what is your kind of strategy for keeping people motivated and oriented towards your vision?
What we're hearing, first of all, I think you can probably gather from comments that I've made before, I really believe in trying to find as many ways to hear the voices of your team as possible, because I think that's the most important thing, is to understand what are their challenges, what are inherent challenges, what are challenges that we can fix, but finding ways to bring that information in is really important. And what we have been hearing, like a lot of companies, I think, in the post COVID era, is that people are feeling overworked because they continued at the same pace that they were, but we were perhaps not as mindful of people's downtime because we were scheduling Zoom and Teams calls. And unfortunately, some of those habits may have prevailed post COVID. And so we have heard that workload is a problem. And I think what we're seeing, not just in my company, but across the many companies, as we're looking at what is being called the Great Resignation, portable functions like legal are some of the first to feel potential attrition. So we're trying to understand what are those motivators that are influencing people to look outside of our organization. What are the things that are really important for people to stay within our organization? So workload is important, but then more importantly, career path, and how does somebody navigate an organization like mine that is large, complex, agile. It changes its structure to meet the business demands. So roles that may have existed 2 years ago may not exist in 2 years. And so what they're really hungry for is understanding what are the skills that I need and how do I get them to navigate through this organization. So we're doing a lot to try to make sure that we're mapping those, we're communicating with the teams, we're delivering to them those things that can make it easier for them to navigate within our organization.
Yeah, I do think that many organizations are facing some of those similar challenges. The other thing I've heard you say over the course of our conversation is that you value the diversity of thought and diversity of perspective. You also said earlier that you're often the only woman in the room. So, what is your perspective on the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives? And how are you leading in that area for the legal function for the company?
First, I probably need to say that luckily in the last, I'm going to say 5 to 10 years in my career, I'm probably not always the only woman in the room. So I think that's a good change going forward. One of the things that I think we need to think about with diversity inclusion is what are the skills that we need to bring individuals into our organization, and how do we create the pipeline that is a truly diverse pipeline so that we can build populations to bring into the organization. For example, my company is a company that is focused on technology development, and most of our senior leaders are engineers. And unfortunately, we're still putting out fewer female engineers, for example, than we are male engineers. So our organization has looked at endowing female engineering and STEM professorships, for example, so that there are images of what success could look like even as early as women coming into engineering school. And I've personally tried to support my own law school looking at underrepresented communities in the pipeline. What I've also enjoyed doing is working with some law firms that are being very progressive. We're looking forward to welcoming a summer intern that is part of a law firm that we partner with, their diversity and inclusion outreach. So they've brought in diverse candidates, 1Ls, into their law firm, and they're spending part of their time this summer with the firm, but then they're asking clients to take those interns into their company for a couple of weeks to learn what it's like to be inside a client organization. And I think that's a really great experience because many of their peers will not see the inside out, if you will, from a client perspective. And I think it will give them a differentiated skill set. So anything that we can do to really prime the pipeline, I think is really key. And then I think it's really important that we cast as wide a net as possible when we have opportunities, and that we're thoughtful about how we reach out and bring people into our organization. And the last thing about that is that we just always need to be very mindful and look at the data to make sure that, for example, members of underrepresented communities aren't leaving at a faster rate, because that would be an indication that there is a problem with them really feeling included in your organization. So to me, it's all of those things are really part of what we need to all be thinking about in terms of really making sustainable change.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that summer intern program is great. It's sounds completely aligned with your own career trajectory and having that business exposure. And the notion that we should be using data to make better informed decisions is also one that I subscribe to. And I actually think we as the legal profession as a whole are making some progress in learning how to harness the data and then use it in a better, more thoughtful way. What else are you passionate about in your career and professional life?
So I think it's important for all of us to think about ways to get back to the communities in which we live and work. That is something that is important to me. It's something that's important to my company, and that can look different ways to different people. I think for lawyers, we tend to be well compensated, which gives us an opportunity to have impact that perhaps others may not always. So that is really important. I don't think there's one way to give back. And so it may be community, it may be through religious organizations, it may be through bar organizations, it may be starting your own specific outreach organization. But any and all of those are great ways to give back. One of the issues that I am passionate about, and starting to work with others in my industry to see if there are ways that we can make an impact, and building on some good work that others in my industry are already doing, is around human trafficking. I Unfortunately, Houston has, in terms of reporting to some of the human traffic hotlines within the United States, the highest volume of calls, which indicates to us that we may have a concern here. And because we are close to the border, it sometimes means that people are brought in or brought out through Houston, its airports, its ports. So, as a mother of daughters, and as somebody that really believes that everyone should be treated fairly and have the freedom to decide who and what they do and who they work for, that's an issue that I really want us to focus on more, because I think if we all focus on it, it's something that should be solvable.
Yeah, it's a significant issue. And I think, although it's not one I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time on, I have been pleased that I think we're making some progress in terms of how we even begin to address the issue. And hopefully that makes a positive impact on the lives of the people who are stuck in that system.
That's exactly right. And as we're talking about resiliency and lawyers, one of the things about the issue that I had not really contemplated, but sometimes even if it's for domestic help, could be a nanny, could be somebody that is brought into a country as a maid or a housekeeper for a family. Oftentimes they may not have the full documentation, and so if there is a disagreement with the family that has brought them into the country, they may not have the paperwork or the finances to get home. And I know that in my community, there are legal organizations that are starting to try to work on pro bono basis to help them get the documentation and the support that they need. So there are many ways where the legal profession can really support some of the efforts that are happening for that issue. But as I said, for many other issues, whatever somebody's passionate about, I just encourage them to get involved.
Yeah, and one of the things you said earlier occurs to me to be relevant here also, and that's making sure you're not trying to be the smartest person in the room. Because I think for many people who don't know lawyers or haven't worked with lawyers, just lawyer generally can be an intimidating person. And the court system for sure can be intimidating. And if you are from a country where the political systems, the court systems may not be trustworthy, what a terrifying process. And so, being a person who can bring clarity to that in everyday language, and I know as lawyers, we can't assure any outcome, but we can assure people that they have help. I think that goes a long way.
I couldn't agree more. I think you said it very well. It's the ability for us to really make that human connection and just make somebody feel seen, recognized, and that they have an advocate. Um, at its heart, the legal profession is a service profession. And I think if we keep that mindset, particularly as we take it into all aspects of our work, but for those causes that we may be feeling drawn to, I think we can really be impactful.
Yeah. Well, Diane, I want to thank you for taking time to chat with me today. I really enjoyed talking about your story, your career trajectory, your thoughts on how the legal profession has changed and places where we can have impact. So, thank you for taking the time.
Well, I really enjoyed being part of it, Lori. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Diane, it's been fascinating to hear how you've built a successful career as a legal leader. I'm inspired by your professional achievements and your dedication to DEI. You've set an impressive example for using your talents to not only grow your career, but also to make a lasting impact at your company and in your community. We've covered a lot on today's episode, and if you want to know more about the Chief Legal Officer's role and the many perspectives across legal leadership, visit us on Deloitte.com and search Chief Legal Officer. Want to hear from other legal leaders on this podcast? What can we bring you next? Please share your feedback. We really want to hear from you about topics and leaders of interest. Hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter to share your ideas. For more insights from many iconic and resilient leaders, just go to Deloitte.com/US/resilient. Until next time, stay safe and remain resilient.